Alright everybody, this time we're going to talk about the NES port of Super Mario World. Now I'm not going to pretend that this is some obscure unknown port by now. I'm pretty sure that most people who are into retro gaming already know that this port exists. The port was released around 1995 by Hammer Team, who I'm going to keep referring to as Hammersoft in this video probably, because that's how I've learned to call them, and I always call them Hammersoft instead of Hammer Team. Anyway, this port was actually sold here in Macedonia. It was sold in Russia, in Serbia, it was sold in China, in the developing world, and many kids don't even know that the game they played on the NES, known as Super Mario World, was actually a bootleg copy. To them, this was just an NES version, or a Nintendo version as we'd call them, or a dandy version depending on your region. It was just an NES version of Super Mario World. One of the most impressive aspects about the game are its visuals. At times they're very close to the SNES original. The sheer scope and variety in levels, as well as variety in visuals and tiles used in the game, is absolutely mind-blowing. From forests to underground and underwater levels, this game has it all. It even has the ghost houses I dislike so much. So yeah, there's choppiness here and there, but that doesn't matter because overall when you look at the game, it just looks phenomenal. Like at a glance, you might get confused at times that this is the SNES version. Now, if I remember correctly, Miyamoto once said, back in the day when the SNES was coming out, that they were trying to make Super Mario World for the NES, but they couldn't do it because they couldn't make Yoshi work. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but back in the day, probably it was. Now, this game was released years later, and probably programming techniques were different at the time, so Hammer Team did manage to create a fully functional Yoshi in Super Mario World NES, and that's something to be applauded, of course. In fact, one of the most impressive aspects of the Yoshi in the NES port of Super Mario World is how Yoshi functions as a separate entity. For example, if the player picks up a power-up, the power-up is applied to Mario, however Yoshi is unaffected by it, as it should be. Another impressive thing about Yoshi is when the player drops him off somewhere and goes off to do something that needs to be done without Yoshi, for example like climbing a vine or something, when the player comes back, Yoshi is waiting exactly where he was dropped off. So this, in my opinion, is actually very impressive for an NES game. Now, when it comes to Mario's moveset, we have power-ups such as the cape, which work pretty decently. There's the fire flower, and Mario can do his spin jump, which is riddled with many problems. You can't destroy blocks with it, but you can deal more damage to certain enemies. The spin jump is activated by pressing up and jump, which can be a huge problem because sometimes on some controllers you end up accidentally hitting a diagonal, like forward and up diagonal, and that triggers the jump, so you end up dying a lot in this game. As far as controls go, the jump mechanics are pretty broken. Mario comes to a still or his movement slows down when he performs a jump, which really messes things up, in my opinion, and makes jumping to be a lot more difficult than it should be. And there's the issue of slopes. For example, if you go upward on a slope, Mario's speed increases, and drastically so. But if Mario goes down a slope, well, his speed suddenly comes to a crawl and slows down drastically. Now, if you don't know to expect this already, this can really trip you up if you're familiar with the original game. It's not something that you can't get used to, but it makes the game not play as well as it should. Switches are mostly all gone, except ones that spawn certain platforms here and there. However, you can easily permanently lose these switches, so it's up to the player to either figure out how to get past the obstacle they were supposed to make easier, or simply die and replay that part of the level without losing the switch. There's no switches that turn coins into solid blocks, there's no switches that make invisible blocks permanently appear in the game, and so forth. As far as level design in general is concerned, there's obvious problems that Hammer Team didn't seem to be able to address, either they couldn't address them on time or they just didn't know how to address these issues. I'm actually very impressed by the fact that this game has checkpoints, because many bootleg games on both the NES and the Sega Mega Drive lack checkpoints when they should have them. I'm very impressed by the fact that the checkpoints remain even after you leave a level, because Hammer Team knew full well that the game has issues with controls and enemy movement, enemy collisions, and so forth, so they're very generous with how many lives they give the player. In fact, you can actually farm infinite lives by simply entering a Yoshi house and leaving it. You can keep doing this for as long as you need to farm up lives. And if you happen to need extra lives in the middle of a level after you've hit a checkpoint in a level, so you can simply pause the level, hit select, leave the level and go to the nearest Yoshi house to farm up enough lives, then come back and your level will resume from the checkpoint. Most pipes that you should be able to enter cannot be entered, and most secrets in the game have been removed. However, some pipes can still be entered and some secret areas have been kept intact. Question mark blocks don't work properly. They contain no coins and only work when they contain power-ups, a Yoshi, or an extra life. Still, the game has quite a few levels and they're all unlocked from the start, so you don't have to beat the entire adventure in one sitting. The music in this port isn't all bad either. Sometimes it sounds actually very close to the original and sometimes it's a royal mess. But I guess that can be forgiven. It's very clear that Hammer Team put a lot of love and effort into this one. However, for whatever reason, I believe that the developers simply did not have enough time to finish it, so I personally believe that they were rushed and that they had to get it out as soon as possible without having the time to actually clean up all the issues. Had the game been given another year of development, I believe it would have been on par with Mario 3 on the NES in terms of controls, and it would have definitely been the best Super Mario game on the platform, or at least it would have been the most impressive one. So is Mario World for the NES worth your time? Heck yes it is! It's something that you absolutely must check out, because even though the game isn't perfect, even though the game is very much flawed, it's still this unique experience that if you can play on real hardware, you should definitely give it a shot.